I greet you all and welcome you back to the lesson. The subject is financial management. Today we continue with the study of the various sources of finance for businesses. Today we will focus our attention on hire purchase financing, which is a medium-term source of finance. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to highlight the characteristics, the benefits, and the disadvantages of hire purchase financing. First of all, we'll describe what hire purchase financing is. And candidates, it is a type of arrangement where a buyer pays for a product or an asset in installments while having the right to use the asset during the repayment period. The buyer does what? Pays for a product, but at the same time uses the product or the asset during the repayment period. And hire purchase is a medium-term source of funds. It is a medium source of funds that can be used by businesses to acquire equipment, to acquire machinery, to acquire motor vehicles, and other assets. And this type of financing has some unique characteristics, just like the other types of sources of financing that we have studied. So in this lesson, we begin by outlining the characteristics of hire purchase. Characteristics. The first characteristic is in relation to asset ownership. Asset ownership. Remember, we've said that hire purchase is where a buyer pays for an asset in installments while having the right to use the asset. So how about ownership? Does the buyer have the right to ownership of the asset? No, the buyer does not own the asset outright until the final installment is paid. That is one characteristic of hire purchase financing. The buyer only has the right to use the asset but has no right of ownership. The right of ownership is only transferred after the buyer pays the last installment. 2. Installment payments. That's yet another feature of hire purchase. Hire purchase involves regular installment payments over a specified period, typically ranging from 1 year to 5 years. Because this is a medium-term source. We said one feature of medium-term sources of finance is that they range from 2 years to 5 years. So the installment period is between 2 to 5 years, and the installment amount includes both principal and interest. 3. Medium-term nature. Medium-term nature. What does that mean? Now, hire purchase is considered a medium-term financing option. Why? Because the repayment period usually exists or extends within 1 year, but is shorter than long-term financing. It can be 1 year, it could be 2 years, 3 years, but it cannot be more than 5 years. It's a medium-term source of finance. 4. Security. There is a feature related to what we call security interest. This is where now the asset being financed serves as the security. The asset being financed serves as the security, because remember that the payer or the buyer pays for the asset installments, the asset, the possession. The buyer has the possession but does not have the right of ownership. So that very asset serves as security. You understand? If the buyer defaults on payments, then the seller has the right to repossess the asset. Why? Because the ownership remains with the seller, and if the buyer fails to pay, then that asset is used as security. Interest rate. There is also a characteristic related to the interest rate. Now, the interest rates for hire purchase agreements can be fixed or can be variable depending on the terms negotiated between the buyer and the seller. And we know candidates that fixed rates provide predictability in repayment. There could also be flexibility in terms. There is flexibility in terms of hire purchase, meaning that the terms of hire purchase agreements can be flexible and may be tailored to the specific needs of the buyer, including the size of the down payment, including the installment amounts, and the duration of the repayment period. They are flexible. The buyer and the seller can agree. They can tailor these terms. Flexibility in terms. 7, upfront costs. Now, candidates, upfront costs. In hire purchase finance, the buyer is required to make a down payment. Then the balance is paid in installments. So a down payment is typically required at the beginning of the hire purchase agreement. That's what we are calling upfront cost. And this initial payment may be a percentage of the total cost. Number 8, there is maintenance responsibility as a feature. In many hire purchase agreements, the buyer is responsible for the maintenance and upkeep of the asset during the financing period. Unlike in a finance lease agreement, where the maintenance cost rests with the lessor. All right? Maintenance responsibility. It is the buyer who is responsible for maintaining the asset during the repayment period. Do you understand? Another characteristic in relation to tax matters, okay, or implication. What is the tax implication of this source? Tax implication. Now, depending on the jurisdiction, the buyer may be eligible for certain tax benefits related to hire purchase finances, such as deducting interest payments before tax. There is also an aspect of early payment settlement. Early payment settlement. Now, some hire purchase agreements allow the buyer to settle the outstanding amount before the end of the expiry period without any penalties. Though in some cases, there may be penalties or fees that is associated with early payment. That's a feature of hire purchase. Then there is 11, specific asset financing. Specific asset financing means that not all assets can be financed through hire purchase. Do you understand? It may mean that hire purchase is commonly used for financing specific assets like motor vehicles, like equipment, like machinery, and so on. Some assets like land may not be purchased through hire purchase agreements. It may not be suitable for general working capital needs also. So if you are looking for finances to meet your working capital needs, then hire purchase may not be the best option. So there are many more characteristics. These are 11. Let's move on to discuss the advantages. We have many characteristics that we can continue mentioning, like the risk of depreciation. There is risk of depreciation as far as hire purchase finance is concerned. By that I mean that the buyer bears the risk of asset depreciation during the hire purchase period, because the value of the asset may decrease over time. So businesses considering hire purchase financing should carefully review the terms and conditions of the agreement and assess their ability to make regular payments and weigh the benefits of the agreement, assess their ability to make regular payments, assess the benefits versus costs, and so on. That's why here we are discussing advantages or benefits. There could also be legal and tax implications which should be considered. Professional advice may also be sought to ensure that there is a thorough understanding of the lease agreement or the hire purchase agreement. So it's important to identify for us to study the benefits of this type of finance. The first benefit is that the buyer can have access to assets without large upfront costs. Access to the asset without huge upfront costs. Remember, we say that the buyer may be allowed to just make a deposit at the beginning, a down payment. So hire purchase allows businesses to acquire assets immediately without having to incur substantial upfront payments, and that can be beneficial for businesses that is beneficial to businesses with limited available capital. Limited available capital. Businesses with limited available capital can have access to assets without necessarily having to pay huge upfront costs. Number 2, there is flexibility in terms. Flexible terms. Hire purchase agreements often offer flexibility in terms, allowing businesses to negotiate aspects such as the size of the down payment, installment amounts, the duration of the payment period, and so on. There is that element of flexibility in terms as identified under characteristic number 6. 3, fixed interest rates. Fixed interest rates. Many hire purchase agreements come with fixed interest rates, which provide businesses with the predictability in repayment and protection against interest rate fluctuations. Hire purchase payments are not subject to market conditions. That means that if interest rates increase, then that may not affect the interest rate agreed upon between the buyer and the seller of the asset. Potential tax benefit. Potential tax benefit. Now, depending on the jurisdiction, businesses may be eligible for tax benefits related to hire purchase financing, such as deducting interest payment as a business expense. We all know that tax is paid on profit, the net profit. You apply a rate on the net profit. So what benefit here arises because the interest on hire purchase may be deducted from the profits before applying the tax rate. So that is a benefit. It reduces the amount of tax that a business is liable to pay. Potential tax benefit. 5. Asset as a collateral. All right? Asset as collateral. How is that a benefit? Now, the asset being financed serves as a collateral, reducing the need for additional security. Because we remember the possession is transferred from the buyer to the seller. The asset that the buyer now has possession of become the security for financing. And that is a benefit because now the seller is not required anymore to provide additional security. And that can make hire purchase financing more accessible for businesses with limited assets. 6. Ownership at the end is yet another advantage. Once all payments are made, the buyer gains full ownership of the asset, and the eventual transfer of ownership can be an advantage for businesses looking to expand their asset base. So these are 6 benefits. We can add more, like being suitable for specific assets can be a benefit. Suitable for specific assets. Hire purchase is only suitable for specific assets, like motor vehicles, machinery, equipment, which allows businesses to match financing terms. The financing term becomes now easy to match the financing term or period with the useful life of the asset. You understand? Advantages. Disadvantages of hire purchase financing. One is the overall cost is high. Overall cost. Now, the total cost of hire purchase financing, including interest and the down payment, may be higher compared to making outright purchase. Why? Because the buyer is essentially paying for the convenience of spreading payment over time. Compared to outright purchase, hire purchase is more expensive. The overall cost is high compared to outright purchase. Number 2, there is risk of repossession. With hire purchase comes the risk of repossession. If the buyer defaults on payments, the seller has the right to repossess the asset. And that can pose a risk to the business, especially if the asset is essential for operations. There is risk of repossession. There is also another risk known as depreciation risk. Depreciation risk. The buyer bears the risk of asset depreciation during the hire purchase period. So if the asset's value decreases significantly, then the buyer may still be obligated to pay the agreed upon amount. we mentioned upfront cost here. This upfront cost is a disadvantage. Upfront costs, and this may include the down payment. Now, while hire purchase requires a smaller upfront repayment compared to outright purchase, a down payment is still required, which may pose a challenge for the business with the limited liquidity. From the word go, day one, the buyer is required to make an upfront in form of a down payment. So businesses that have cash flow problems may struggle to make this upfront cost, and that is a disadvantage. 5, fixed repayment. There is a fixed repayment schedule. How is that a disadvantage? Now, the structured repayment schedule may lack the flexibility needed for businesses experiencing fluctuations in cash flows, and missed payments can lead to repossession of the asset. So there is fixed repayment schedule, which is disadvantageous. Early settlement fees. Now, currently, the reason why a buyer may opt for hire purchase is because the buyer may not have enough money to purchase an asset. So he makes a down payment, then settles the balance in installments. But within the term of the period within which the buyer is paying, the buyer may have the money to settle the balance, but that may come at a fee, what we are calling early settlement fee. So some hire purchase agreements have penalties or fees that are associated with settling the outstanding amount before the agreed upon term, and that can limit flexibility for businesses. Maintenance. This maintenance responsibility is another disadvantage. Maintenance responsibility. Remember, we said maintenance responsibility. We say that it is the responsibility of the buyer to maintain the asset throughout the repayment period. The buyer is generally responsible for maintenance and the upkeep of the asset, adding additional costs and responsibilities to the business. 8, it's not ideal for intangible assets. This form of financing is not ideal for assets that are intangible. It is only suitable generally for tangible assets. For intangible assets or services, other financing options may be more appropriate. So these are 8 disadvantages. 1, overall cost. 2, risk of repossession. 3, there is asset depreciation risk. 4, upfront costs like down payment. 5, fixed repayment schedule. 6, there are early settlement penalties. 7, maintenance responsibility, not ideal for intangible assets. We outlined 7 advantages. 1, access to the asset without huge upfront cost. The buyer has access to the asset without huge upfront cost, because the buyer is only required to make a down payment, which is a percentage of the total cost of the asset. It could be 10% or even 15% or 10%, then the rest is paid in installments. It may come with flexible terms, it's an advantage. Fixed interest rate is an advantage. Potential tax benefits, an advantage. Asset may be used as security is an advantage. The ownership at the end is an advantage. Then it is suitable for specific assets. These are advantages. Then we outlined 11 characteristics of hire purchase finance. One is based on asset ownership. Number 2, installment payments. Number 3, medium term nature. Number 4, collateral. Number 6, interest rate. Number 7, flexibility in terms. Number 8, number 7, upfront cost. Number 8, maintenance responsibility. Number 9, tax implication. Number 10, early payment settlement. Then specific asset financing. So that marks the end of the lesson. And in summary, candidates, we can say that before entering into a hire purchase agreement, businesses should carefully assess their financial situation. Businesses should consider the specific terms of the arrangement and also evaluate alternative financing options. Professional advice may also be beneficial to ensure that the chosen financing method aligns with the business overall strategy and financial goals. So that marks the end of the lesson. I'm going to give you today's assignment on hire purchase financing. Question number 1. What are the main features of hire purchase financing and how does it differ from traditional loan financing in terms of ownership and risk? Number 2. How can businesses assess the cost effectiveness of opting for hire purchase financing and what considerations should be taken into account when deciding between hire purchase and outright purchase? 3. What legal and financial implications should both buyers and sellers be aware of in a hire purchase agreement, and how can potential conflicts or misunderstandings be mitigated? I repeat the third question. What legal and financial implications should both buyers and sellers be aware of in a hire purchase agreement, and how can potential conflicts and misunderstandings be mitigated? Thank you for attending the lesson. I'll hope to meet you in our next session where we begin our discussion on the short-term sources of finance. The syllabus only allows us to consider 2 sources of medium-term financing, which you have done. In our next session, we'll be looking at the short-term sources of finance. The medium-term sources are the hire purchase finance and the medium-term loans. Thank you. God bless you. Bye-bye.